Welcome to Wash Talk, the Carwash Podcast. I'm your host, Rich DiPaolo, and joining me today is John-Michael Tamburro, Managing Director of Carwash Advisory. John-Michael, thanks for taking some time to do this interview with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Rich. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I understand M&A activity is starting to pick up again in this car wash industry, so I know your time is valuable, and I certainly appreciate you taking a few minutes here to discuss today's topic, which is purchase agreements, right? So let's start off with the first obvious question. What is a purchase agreement?
For sure. And I think it's a great question and something that at least I'm hoping that everyone can benefit from, because I think we've all hopefully experienced it. If you're in the car wash space or, you had any sort of interaction doing a transaction before, it's something that's fundamental and something that I think we believe, everyone should understand, right? It shouldn't be lawyer talk. It shouldn't be, you have to hire someone to do it. You should at least be able to have the fundamentals, and hopefully we can give a foundation today for those individuals. So I guess to start off, really simply put, a purchase agreement, it's effectively the primary legal document for the sale of a business that really outlines the ownership of a company or an asset from one party to another. So usually there's a buyer or seller or multiple parties involved. And this is what facilitates, at least the initial part of the transaction. There's two main ones that are worth kind of giving an overview on today. The first, which is less common usually for larger corporations, is what's called a share purchase agreement. And this is where effectively a seller is going to transfer their shares, which is the ownership of this entity, into the name of a buyer or a new party, right? So they're actually buying the shares, right? So an interesting point here is that when you're buying the shares, it means that you're also inheriting any sort of existing profits, responsibilities, liabilities, and most notably, probably the business risk when you're entering into the form of agreement, right? So something to keep in mind. I think that's probably a low probability and low percentage of users would actually enter to this type of agreement, but that's sort of the primary. And the second and the most common really in the car wash space is what's known as an asset purchase agreement or an APA. Now, an APA is effectively when the individual or collection of individuals, basically they're selling the assets and they're transferring these assets to the new buyer, right? So rather than, the entire company being inherited as it is in a share purchase agreement, in this case, they're just buying the assets, right? So, I guess what's notable there is, you might be wondering, well, what does this entail, right? And really what it's facilitating is the transfer of things like, obviously goodwill is the big one, machinery, any sort of, creditors, debtors, all that sort of stuff. Anything that's along those lines would be transferred over. And again, the goal here is really to just inherit certain parts of the business as opposed to the entirety and everything inherently that comes along with that. So I guess real brief and short, because that's probably a lot, even though I tried to keep it as simple as possible. Really the biggest difference is with a share purchase agreement, you're effectively selling the shares, right? Whereas the APA is you're only selling select assets, right? And the buyer and the seller can work together to pick and choose what it is. And there's obviously benefits for both, right? So they're both different transactions and they both have very different procedures, but those are the two most common ones that we see in the space today.
Car wash operators are very good at running their businesses, right? They're good at washing cars, keeping customers satisfied and motivating and driving teamwork, right? So when they enter into an agreement or intend to sell their business, I'd imagine it's a bit of a whirlwind and there's a lot going on and a lot of moving parts. So is there one piece of advice that you advise sellers when reviewing these purchase agreements?
Yeah, I guess it's to your point. There's so many moving parts, so many parties involved. It's really hard to narrow it down to one. But I guess if I had to pick one piece of advice, not to find on a technicality, but I think it would be truthfully just having good representation. Now, what I mean by that is it's not just asking yourself objectively, do I have a good lawyer or do I have an advisor that's done M&A before? Because the reality is there's many good lawyers out there and there's many good advisors out there that technically don't qualify as good representation. And what I mean by that is to me, and I always like to approach this from the standpoint of, if I'm a business owner, what would I want to see, right? What is something that I would place value on? Because, we see tons of transactions, weekly, daily, and annually of different magnitudes. We've seen a lot of the kinks, right? And we've got down the rabbit hole, and I'm hoping that, this will ground it for people. But effectively for me, there's three things that always jump out, right? So good representation to me means, first of all, number one on the legal side is we want to have legal counsel that has done obviously M&A before, right? So, and not just M&A in general, but really in volume, but also in magnitude, which is something that a lot of people overlook, right? Because, if you have a lawyer that represents you and they've helped you acquire a single site, even if they're acquiring one car wash a year over the last 3 years for you, yeah, they've done M&A and they have experience, but that's also not the same experience as a lawyer who's done maybe a 5-site acquisition in 1 year and then a 3-site acquisition in another year, or a double site, right? And so on and so forth, right? So there's two very different things, right? And the first thing that we need to ask yourself is, what am I selling, right? And make sure that this representation and they've covered the gamut, right? So, for a lawyer, it's having someone that's done hopefully a transaction in the same realm as what you're hiring them to do, right? Because if they haven't, again, it doesn't mean they're a bad lawyer. It just means that they're probably not the most appropriate party. And again, this is all extremely, extremely important because, the lawyer is one of many people that are going to help you hopefully maximize any sort of impact or value add, after you start working through this process, right? So that's sort of the first level of good representation. The second is, I guess, very, very similar, but it wouldn't be the legal side. This is actually on the M&A side, right? So as I'm sure you and many viewers know, there is a ton of representation. Excuse me. So, there's real estate firms that do this. There's investment banks. There's business brokers. There's also individuals, right? We've come across, probably more advisors, than we would like, but it's the space, right? And it's also really, really challenging for the consumer to know, who do I choose, right? And it's hard because I would say that different people define and place emphasis or even overemphasis on certain characteristics. But it really all comes down to what are you looking for, right? My needs as a business owner could be very different, Rich, than your needs as a business owner, right? And different advisors will probably appeal more to you than they do to me just for that simple reason, right? And for me, I always try again to take a step back objectively and say, what do I really need, right? What have I seen owners and operators, truly need from me as their representative in the past, right? And it all comes down to trust above all else. And I always say, don't go with me because you like me. Don't go with someone else because you like them. Go with the person that you trust the most. Because at the end of the day, everyone is professionals. There's a big enough pond for everyone to play in. You have to go with someone, and I would want to go with someone that I can trust above all else, right? So what does this mean? Because it's very vague, right? How is having a couple conversations with someone, how does that convey the level of trust, right? And it's just so difficult, right? So for me, again, I always kind of bring it back home and say, well, I want someone that has experience. I want them to bring a level of professionalism to the table so that I never have to question their motives, right? I need to know that whoever my advisor is, they are solely motivated by this desire to help me achieve the best possible results, no matter what that is, right? Because they don't, you don't always like what you find out or what you uncover, but at least if you know that you have the best person behind you and that's helping you hopefully drive towards, the end goal, and you know that they have no distractions, there's no partnerships behind the scenes, there's no compensation from buyers. That is the only thing that can really add detriment, right? And a lot of times it's so hard to know. And that's why I say, having someone that you can trust me from a mental standpoint, it just extremely, helps facilitate the process. And it makes it a lot easier for everybody, right? So the advisor, again, solely represent you, your interests. We need to know they're doing the best job possible. You need to know we can trust them. And again, just like having a lawyer, right? They have to have experience in both the volume and the magnitude of what you're looking to achieve, right? And I think it's really the same when you're choosing lawyers or you're choosing your advisors. Is they both have to more or less have the same skill sets in order for it to be effective. And now the last thing, and the last real major component, and this is something that, I think is always overlooked really, is you got to have an advisor and you have to have a lawyer that can actually work together, right? Because, these two parties, they have to complement each other. You have to make sure that they're working together and they're playing on each other's strengths, and there's an, open line of communication, because, without it, you're effectively playing with half a deck of cards, right? And, there's a lot of value add for both parties. And I think in my experience, the best transactions where the client wins, and we usually wins, high head and shoulders above, other transactions, is when you have these two parties really working together, right? And you can lean on them and know that, there's things that your advisor is not going to know, but your lawyer should be able to slot in, right? So the relationship to me really has to be, it has to be symbiotic, right? You have to be working together for one goal. And I think, to me, having good representation, it really means having all three of those things in tandem. And, it's probably sounds like a lot listening to this and listening to me go through it, but the reality is it's pretty easy. And to me, it's common sense. And that's why I would say that is the bare minimum of what you need before you get through the process.
I've talked to a lot of operators over the years, John-Michael, and I've talked to folks who have actually sold their businesses, and I can tell it's personal for them, right? Like, they understand the opportunity and what it means to sell their business, but they really poured literally their blood, sweat, and tears into this business, and it's personal to them, like I mentioned. So I'd imagine one thing that an advisor can do to earn that trust is to make sure they're transparent with the operator and open communication, as you mentioned, and really helping them to understand. So with this next question, I wanted to know some of the common terms that you might see in a purchase agreement, right? What is the purpose of such terms as representations and warranties?
Yeah, so that's a great one. I love this question because for me, this is something that I think is the most overlooked item, right? And lawyers all know about it, advisors all know about it, but as a business owner, you probably never dealt with this before, right? And it's something that is always ill-intentionally pushed to the end, and people don't actually start to address it until they need to. And that's where problems arise, right? So we cover this in a great deal. Carwash Advisory and myself, we wrote what's called a definitive guide to the purchase agreement. And this can be found on our learning section on carwashadvisory.com. And we really outlined this because it's a lot more complicated than people think. And this is where things can veer, right? If it's not addressed appropriately. So it's simply put, it's really the representation portion is it's a statement of fact that's made by each party, the buyer and seller. And the warranties really are, you think of it as a promise regarding certain aspects of the transaction, right? So, you're giving assurances, you're giving promises, and just taking a step, away from the legal side of things. It's something that I'm sure everyone has done in a transaction before, no matter who it is, right? If you've bought a car wash, you're doing this probably without realizing it, right? It's as simple as something like, hey, all my equipment works and it's in good working order, right? So, if you're willing to say that and to sell a business on those premises, then when the transaction closes and the buyer starts on day one, then you better be sure that it does what you say you're going to do, right? And there's a lot of times where there's discrepancies and times where you make a statement and it doesn't turn out to be the case, right? And it's not always with malicious intent. It happens. It's the nature of things. But, the whole reason for this is the assurances help to build trust between both parties, right? And it's really the basis for any sort of legal recourse, right? And that way, if any statements or facts that one party is making to the other is proven to be untrue later on, then there's a foundation of how to handle it, right? It is common for the seller to make significantly more representations and warranties than the buyer, right? And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because ultimately, you're selling a business. I always tell our clients that I'll never know your business as well as you do, right? And I can sit here for months and I can ask you every question that I can think of, but the reality is, you're boots on the ground. You've lived in this world for 1, 2, 3, 10 years in some instances. It doesn't matter how much work I do or how good I am at this, I will never know it, right? And that's where, like you said earlier, having that clear line of communication and making sure that, both parties are 100% transparent. This isn't supposed to be a bad thing, right? You should never look at reps and warranties and say, oh, they're trying to get me, right? The goal of this is really, you want both parties to feel protected and comfortable that what everybody's saying is fair. And in the event that it's not, we have a path forward of how to remedy it. So that is really where it comes up. But it is the number one most overlooked item in a purchase agreement that I would recommend getting in front of, definitely earlier on the better.
All right, let's talk about another stage of the purchase agreement, and that's the due diligence period. Right?
Yeah.
So how important is the due diligence period, and what are some tips that you could offer to ensure that this portion of the process can be performed smoothly?
Definitely. So the due diligence process is usually the most time-consuming and exhausting process, right? And I always tell people, this is where the real work gets done. Right. This is where, all parties roll up their sleeves and you dig in, right? Because it's very easy to get that LOI, to get someone to commit to a price. But ultimately, at that stage in the game and after, a couple weeks or maybe a month of review, there's no way any buyer can really understand everything to do with the business and to know what they're getting themselves into, right? So this period where we do all the homework and we roll up our sleeves is what's called the due diligence process, right? So I guess at a high level, there's sort of an order of operations. And usually what we see happen is, so the LOI is received, there's a letter of intent in place, which basically says, it outlines high level terms of the purchase agreement, right? They're usually not binding. Sometimes they're negotiated later on for certain reasons, but it's really just we'll call it a skeleton purchase agreement that tells everyone, hey, we're willing to move forward in good faith. And these are sort of some of the things that we're agreeing to based on what we've seen today, right? So once we have that outlined, really the due diligence process starts as soon as that LOI is signed, right? Whether you know it or not. And the thing that usually kickstarts due diligence is what's called the quality of earnings. And this is where effectively the buyer is going to review your financial statements, your tax returns, bank statements, and they're trying to ensure that all of the financials that you've proven to date basically triangulate, all with the backup material and the back end of the business, right? So it's really the most important process, because if you're telling someone a business is doing X dollars in revenue and X dollars of net income and X dollars of EBITDA, well, then we need to make sure that it's actually reconcilable and we can prove out that number, right? Because it's very easy to say it's doing one thing, but if you dig into it and there's a large discrepancy in numbers, then there's a problem, right? Because the buyer isn't buying what they thought they were buying, right? So the goal in this process, it's sort of counterintuitive, but everybody thinks that it's negative, right? And people are trying to renege and renegotiate, but truthfully, the goal of the quality of earnings isn't to challenge or negotiate any numbers. It's really to substantiate, right? And make sure that everything that's been reported is true and it's fair and there's no discrepancies, right? So, we always tell owners that think of it more as a check the box exercise as opposed to, let's see, how creative we can get with things, right? So it's very much a systematic process that it happens in really every industry. But really, if a deal is going to fall apart, this is where it falls apart. And more 9 times out of 10, like this is where any sort of problems or things that, sometimes the advisor's not aware of, sometimes even the owners aren't aware of it. This is where, you air out the dirty laundry, so to speak, right? So, the biggest thing here is that you want to make sure that, anything that you think might be a problem down the road or any sort of nuanced situation about your operating structure, or maybe your, how you have like a propco and an opco and how the revenue is shared and reported, anything that you think might be different or unique, it's really important to get out in front of it, right? Because if you wait too late, right, what ends up happening is you've spent, we'll call it a month to get an LOI, and then another 3 weeks to get to the point where they say, oh, if we knew the business was like this, like we never would have moved forward, we're pulling out, right? And again, buyers don't like pulling out of transactions, as hard as it is for people to believe, because it costs them money, right? And nobody likes to spend money, especially if they want to buy something and they've been misled, right? So taking a step back and taking it from a buyer perspective, which people don't think, is people don't like wasting time, right? Yes, there are buyers that will play games, but if you have a true buyer with intent to purchase the business, they want to move forward. So anything that comes up, we always tell our clients, tell me at the beginning, right? It's a lot easier for me to firefight, or for me to maybe, make it 100% transparent the day we launch the process, because at least we know that by the time we get to this stage, there's not going to be any surprises, right? And it saves everybody time and money, because again, it's like you said, I mean, it's exhausting, especially for owners, going to bed every night, not knowing if, someone's going to buy your business or they're not. I mean, the last thing we need is for you to be worrying about secrets or things that, you forgot to mention. And it's usually harmless, right? It's not with ill intent, but it happens. So that's really the big chunk of due diligence. And that happens right at the beginning. Again, probably one of the most important processes. And it's where deals, if they are going to fall apart, that's where they'll fall apart. From there, really how I would classify the remaining portion of due diligence, it's I guess simply put, it's where the lawyers really get involved, right? So that's where they're circulating the physical document of the purchase agreement. So it's usually, I've seen ones 60 to 120 pages. And it's basically, that's where you build out the foundation of everything that's being involved, right? So once you're through quality of earnings, it's almost like everybody takes a breath of relief, because it's like, okay, everything is good. And from there, really what you're doing is you're circulating the agreement, and then you're reviewing any sort of documents about the business, right? So things like the corporate structure, maybe your employees, how you hire them, your training, even things as silly as like insurance policies or vendor contracts. And it's really that portion of due diligence. It's usually a lot smoother and there's less problems, because all you're doing is communicating everything you've been doing to run your business, and there's less room for things to go astray, right? Because if a buyer doesn't like how you're doing things, 9 times out of 10, they're not married to it, and they're just going to change it when they acquire you, right? But the quality of earnings is more, think of it as black and white, right? Either it's going to work and the numbers make sense for the investment thesis, or it doesn't, right? So once you get through that, the next part, it's usually equally as long, if not a bit longer, again, depending on, how complicated the structure of your company is and all these different layers. But really it's sort of the balance of what's left, right? And again, it's super overwhelming and super daunting. And I guess really the most important thing is, in this aspect of the business and diligence, at least everyone always asks me, well, like, what are some tips? What are some ways that, we can make this easier, right? Because if we've never done it before, like, how can we get prepared for it, right? So I think the first thing that it sounds extremely obvious, but it's something that people don't think of, because rightfully so, they've never had to, is you want to make sure you're organized, right? You want to make sure that, things like your financial statements, even corporate documents or legal documents, your tax stuff like your tax returns or even property taxes, you'd be surprised the number of owners that, if you don't need to keep this stuff, nice with a bow on it, on the side of your desk, you're not going to do it, right? You have no need to until you're planning to sell it. And it's too late, and it's a lot more work to go and dig up all this information retroactively, right? So I think being organized is really important, and it can save you a lot of aggravation, and it's really easy to do, and everyone can benefit from it. Even if they're not looking to sell their business, just be organized, and it helps you with all aspects of life, right? And I think the second thing is that just knowing how many deals can fall apart through quality of earnings for simple miscommunication, majority of the times, that's where your advisor needs to do their job, right? And that's where you need to make sure that there is that open line of communication, because, a lot of these problems, they can be solved early on, right? There's nothing that's going to be a poison pill where, the deal isn't going to go through because of it. It's just, if you tell people too late, it's almost like, oh, they're trying to hide this, right? Or, oh, this is too much work now that we're in, right? we had this idea in our head of what we're buying, and now instead of buying an apple, we're buying an orange, right? And sometimes that's enough to do it, as silly as it sounds, right? So, share the information, lean on your advisor, let them, take care of it. And that way, this stuff is taken care of right at the beginning of the due diligence process, or even prior to, as opposed to, the last 30 days, right? And that's why, you hear deals fall apart all the time, especially right at the finish line. If I had $1 every time people said, oh, we had, the escrow opened and the money was just about to go into my account, and all of a sudden I feel like the buyer, they ripped the rug out from under me, right? Well, chances are they didn't. It's just it took them that long to find it, right? So that's where you should be, again, communicating, sharing the information with an advisor. But more importantly, this whole due diligence process is not something that the owner should be really dealing with, right? This is something where, if people wonder, why do I get an advisor? Truthfully, it's not to get an LOI, not necessarily to negotiate, because again, surface level people can do that. But ultimately the real difference is the actual execution of this process, right? And this is where, getting a due diligence list from someone and saying, hey, we want to buy your business, but we need to see 300 items on this Excel list and we need it in 2 weeks. Like, again, for someone who's never done it before, a lot of times it's just so overwhelming. And I've seen people get wrapped into this for 6 to 8 months, right? And it's just, it mentally, it breaks you down. It doesn't matter who you are or that, right? And that's why, the biggest value add that I see is, I would say a good majority of the time, if you're getting a 200 question list, the reality is the buyer probably only needs like 60 of those items, right? So having someone that's done this and gone through the process, they can go through it and almost immediately say, need this, don't need this, need this. And again, just the time saving alone for you not having to go through the aggravation, it's a huge benefit. But hopefully that covers a good amount of the process. And for those that have done it before, it is a full-time job. It's extremely exhausting, to say the least.
Well, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the listener out there who either is on the fence about selling their business, or maybe in the future this is an option for them.
Yeah.
What is, I'm listening here and I'm understanding, obviously you're not going to sell your business overnight, right? Like there's a process that, and you have to go through it all. So what is the timing of this whole process, would you say?
Sure. So it's hard because it truthfully, it varies on the business, right? So I would say, to keep it simple, assuming that you have an LOI in place, the entire process really of the quality of earnings that I mentioned, then the remaining due diligence item, along with any sort of negotiation, signing the purchase agreement, all sort of the meat of the transaction. I guess at a very high level, the average is anywhere from about 45 to 80 days, right? Now, again, that is truthfully dependent on the complexity, the corporate structure, and really the number of sites involved, right? So I guess to take that into really, I like to bifurcate it, because there's really two different categories of people selling. An example of, we'd call it a 40 to 50 day process. That's like the single site car wash owner, right? That's someone who has, one location. It doesn't matter if it's a self-serve or an express or whatever, because, if you're selling it to an individual, or if you're selling it to some type of strategic buyer, there's only so many things to look at, right? So as long as you have someone that's on it and moving the process forward, and you're satisfying items, shouldn't take you longer than that, because there's only so much to look at, right? If it gets extended, it usually means that there's problems, right? And then I guess to take it one step further, if you're looking at a process that's 75 to 80 days, that would be like a multi-site package, right? Lots of locations. I guess the example that comes to mind is the Zach's Car Wash portfolio, right? We did that back in December, 19 locations, right? So as you can imagine, Rich, everything there that you need to diligence on a single car wash, basically multiply that by 19, right? And it doesn't matter how organized you are, how clean your books are, it doesn't matter how willing the buyer is. It just takes time, right? And you can only move so fast. There's only so many working hours in a day. So, the biggest lift for either of these processes, if you do want to shorten the timeline, is having someone to quarterback and facilitate, right? And that is the job of an advisor, right? Is to be able to go in there, lead the charge, push things forward, make sure that they're, everybody's accountable, deadlines are met. And that's how you speed it up, right? And I think there is something to be had about, the more a due diligence process gets delayed and extended for whatever reason, there is almost inherent risk that's being added to the equation of things falling through, right? And it's something that we've definitely, there's a lot of data on this, but time and time again is you want to make it a clean process. You want to, turn over all the info that's necessary, but you also want to get it done and moved on, right? And at some point you've got to, you got to stop the bleeding. And there's only so many things, like I said, that you really need to diligence to be comfortable enough to move forward with the acquisition.
Yeah, and PC&D in partnership with Carwash Advisory actually helped break that news of Zach's Autowash in the January 2024 issue. So folks who are interested in reading about that story could certainly head over to carwash.com. And I just had one more question for you, John-Michael. I certainly appreciate you taking some time today. One idea that an operator or a seller might have is they become embedded in the communities that they serve. They know these communities so well. So maybe an idea would be, let me take some chips off the table. Let me sell my car wash location or locations, and then I'll just open up another car wash in the same community. So how do non-competes work in the car wash industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I think it's very different for the car wash industry, as opposed to any other industry. So, I've worked with retail goods, manufacturing, consumer products, airlines, and I think every industry is, I guess you could blanket it and say there is a criteria. But what's really interesting about the car wash space is that we know so much about the businesses and the drivers for, good performing washes. And sort of all the characteristics that go into a good site that, the non-compete is something that, I feel resoundingly comfortable with, because I think we're at a place where we can do it in a fair way that protects both the buyer and the seller in a transaction, right? So I guess to take a step back for those that don't know, so the non-compete clause is basically, it's a form of contractual provision, and effectively one party, which is usually the seller, they basically agree to not engage, right, in certain competitive activities. Now, this is usually outlined over a specific period of time and within a specific geographic area, right? And the geographic area is a lot more focused than people think, right? And in certain industries, there's arguments to be made where, if you're not going to compete in an activity, it should be for the entire state, right? So, if you're supplying, some type of good and your customer base is the whole East Coast, for example, well, you're going to have a lot more restrictive NDA as opposed to a car wash, because as you know, Rich, a lot of the data that we use and that we see comes from you guys. And, the one thing that always jumps out is, I think it's unanimous that, 90 to 95% of your customer base that comes to a car wash, they usually live in a, we'll call it a 5-mile radius. Right. And that's something that, to me, just knowing those facts, it should be very empowering to a seller, because if you know that 95% of your customer base is in a 5-mile radius, well, then why would you sign a non-compete for 30 miles? Like, it just makes no sense, right? There's no need to restrict yourself to that extreme, right? And I know buyers, they're going to hate me saying this. They always want the most protection, but there's being protective and then there's being excessive. Right. And the reality is it's usually settled somewhere in the middle. Right. So that's really with the geography. That's a really important point. And then in terms of, what else is usually layered in there, I guess the one thing that people don't think of, and sometimes it's layered into the non-compete and sometimes it's, a separate document that's attached as part of the APA. And that's what's called a non-solicit agreement. Right. And that's to protect exactly what you mentioned, Rich. Right. Like, what's to stop me from opening a car wash, 10 miles away and then hiring all my employees, right? Because I know they're fantastic. I know that they can get the work in that. So that's what we don't want. So the non-solicit agreement it's another provision outlined in the agreement. And effectively what that does is it says, you can't actively solicit or seek out certain individuals, right? And usually it's restricted to that of employees or managers or people on payroll of the company that's being acquired, right? So again, both of these usually work in tandem. The goal of these, again, is to make sure really that the buyer is protected, right? And, is there a benefit to the seller? Truthfully, there isn't. But, the logic there is, if I'm a buyer and I'm willing to pay you some type of premium to acquire your business, well, I need to make sure that you can't strip it for parts and put me out of business and then go and sell that business to someone else, and so on and so forth, right? So, how this usually takes shape in the car wash space, simply put, is, there's usually we'll call it a 3 to 5 mile radius, bubbled around, each of the sites. And that's the restricted zone, right? And there's usually a term of anywhere from, 1 to 3 years in that 3 to 5 mile radius, where buyers will have to say, we agreed to not operate, we're not going to compete, and we're not going to hire employees in that area. And it's what's right. It's what's fair to do. And that's what people, it's standard, right? Those terms. But it gets a bit more complicated when you have multiple locations, right? And even drawing back, imagine you had 10 sites, right? And if you had 10 sites, in and around, Tampa, right? Tampa's a great market. But if you had 10 sites in Tampa, there is an argument to be made that, you can't just have a 3 to 5 mile radius per site, because if someone's buying 10 locations, they're, again, more likely than not paying an inherently higher premium due to the site count, which would then translate to them wanting to acquire a larger market, right? And if someone says, I want to buy the entire, we'll call it market of Tampa, that could be 100, 200 mile radius from, the midpoint of the washes, right? And again, that's something that it sounds extremely restricting, but again, it's not unreasonable, right? So the goal it's not like they're trying to protect you from doing things. It's really to protect buyers so that, they're getting what they're paying for and they don't have to worry about you ever being a competitor. And, when it expires, if you want to open up shop, then you're welcome to do so. But, at that point, it shouldn't be as much of a concern because, in that time period, that's where buyers can add their value to the business and grow the customer base and get a lot more comfortable. But again, really, really important term. I think something that I would say almost every single transaction that I've seen done, there is always some form of non-compete or non-solicit signed. And again, it's always just making sure that, it's something you need to sign, but you need to understand what's excessive versus what's reasonable. And that way, that, you don't want to open yourself to unnecessary exposure, because if God forbid something happened and, you needed to go back to work and you needed to earn a living or something, then, you don't have to move states just to be able to get a job, right? And for a lot of car wash owners, they've never done anything else other than run a car wash, right? So it's very difficult to ask them to go to a new market with, capital to do it again. So you just want to make sure you're protected on both ends. And it's something that is a reasonable ask for buyers.
Even more of a reason to partner with a trusted advisory firm, because if you're selling your car washes, it's most likely your first and only time maybe you're ever going to go through this process. Yes. An advisory firm would know, based on their experiences with selling other washes, what's excessive and whatnot. So another reason to partner. Well, certainly, John-Michael, you spent a lot of time with me today to go over what is a purchasing agreement or a purchase agreement, and I certainly appreciate your time today. Obviously, as you mentioned, another great resources our listeners can look at is on your website, carwashadvisory.com, where you've written about this very topic, and certainly listeners and operators, interested sellers, even buyers out there could go up and brush up their knowledge of purchase agreements, and we'll include a link to that article in the summary of this podcast episode here. So thanks again for taking the time, John-Michael. It was great
My pleasure.
to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.